Hi, I'm Claire Branton, the co-author of the Smart Plan book, and this is another one of the Smart Plan podcasts. And this one is J for jargon. So we're going to look at jargon as a barrier, why it's a barrier, but more positively, how we can use it as an opportunity. And for this one, I'm joined with Glenn Benson to talk us through, and I'm going to let Glenn explain in a second why I have selected him. So first of all, as always, I'm going to start off with a definition. So jargon is words, expressions that are used in special or technical ways by particular groups of people, often making the language difficult to understand. So that's what we all understand as jargon. So Glenn, do you want to perhaps share why I chose you?
I suppose over the time of my career, I've worked in 4 areas where I suppose jargon is a big part of what we do. And that is, I've worked in facilities, I've worked in health and safety, I've worked in an arts institution, and I also work for an institution that tells the history of natural history. And those 4 disciplines all have their very specific language. And maybe I'm coming to this conversation because I don't necessarily see jargon as a barrier. I've sometimes felt excluded by jargon. I join a lot of project teams, especially when you do health and safety. You're often brought in a little bit further into a project once a project's got going. And you're dealing with a group of people who have built up a relationship with one another, and they're beginning to use a language that helps them to understand their project. Sometimes it can be a little bit like you're trying to break into a bubble, but I would also say that a project needs its own language so that everybody on that project understands that project.
Yeah. And that was the other reason for getting you involved, really, because, as you say, more recently, you've been exposed to my world full of project management jargon. And I know that's been an interesting one for you. And it's been a delight for me, because what you haven't mentioned is one of the reasons why I wanted to use you for this talk was you are my own personal explainer. Because of all of those areas that you work in and you're interested in, there's not really a topic that I can't throw a term at you and you're able to do a wonderful explainer job on it. So as you say, in your world, there isn't really jargon. There's just terms that describe things.
True, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to be clear, and I think it's good that you've put that definition up about what we mean by jargon, because I think sometimes people think jargon is euphemisms, acronyms, and shorthand, if you like. Yeah. But actually, in the true definition of jargon, which is the use of technical terms to explain technical things, I think that's a different matter, which is what we're looking at this evening.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to now take us on to look at when it's a barrier and why it's associated with being a barrier and got a bit of a negative press, really. So, I mean, we've alluded to there that you're getting more and more involved in projects, and certainly there's can develop a project bubble where the project team becomes a bit separate from the rest of the organisation, and part of that is the language, and that's sort of with the unfamiliar as well. So I think one of the reasons why jargon is seen as negative is that it's an unfamiliar term, and we get comforted and we feel better if we're dealing with the familiar. So those are 2 areas that I think you've experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been involved with some pretty big projects in the last few years, and one where I was involved from fairly near the beginning, where I think we did develop almost a glossary, a thesaurus of our own language, which I could see that when other people joined us as a team, that could be a barrier to them. We had to take the time to explain ourselves. And more recently, being involved with a project where, having come late to the table, if you like, I had to learn a lot of language that team were using. And also, having been in bubble, if you like, we began to realize that everyone in the bubble was very aware of the language and what we were all talking about and why we were talking about it. But it came very loud and clear that many people outside our bubble had no idea.
Yeah.
So we had to kind of make some effort to reach out to people.
Yeah, exactly. And I put this jargon meter here because I think, as well as groups and different parts of the organisation and different sectors developing their own language, there are just some common areas where people will start to recoil as soon as they see them. So green area, stuff we're comfortable with. I think for a lot of people, as soon as they see the word transformation, and there's a lot of transformation projects that are going on.
Sure.
There's going to be loads of jargon. I'm just going to be bombarded by all this jargon. And then when we get into the red area, one of them is your area, health and safety, finance, IT. So as soon as people start to think they're going to have to talk about those areas, they expect some jargon, and they're not areas they feel they really want to spend time in. So in your health and safety world, I mean, is jargon really something that you've got to get over that barrier with?
Yeah, I think you do, and I mean, risk assessment is the heart of all health and safety now.
Yeah.
The emphasis is very much on you to look at what your staff do, how they do it, where they do it, for how long they do it, and so on. To then look at the ways that they could potentially be harmed and do something about it. And it's very interesting in the current COVID world, where where we've all been introduced to risk assessment. The government guidance on COVID is all about assessing the risk, particularly in the workplace. And that has, from my experience, I think people have been a little bit scared of that term.
Yeah.
And so the way that I've tried to explain it to them is that we need to look at the way that a virus, which is a hazard, only becomes a risk under certain conditions. And it's understanding that definition of hazard and risk, which is again where potentially the jargon could be a barrier to people. So the first thing I have had to do, and I'm talking about having to do this to about 1,000 staff, is to actually say, this is what hazard means, this is what risk means. And people get very fixated, from my experience with health and safety, about filling in the form. Whereas, and they forget that the form, the risk assessment, the thing that we're asking them to do, is actually a tool to help them fulfill their legal duty, to fill their managerial role. And one of the best examples I can give is actually talking to a colleague of mine who's in charge of about 300 staff, and it was really scary, I think, for her to kind of, I was talking about risk assessments and hazard and risk, and she was really baffled by the idea of having to fill in a form and try and condense what she was having to do for her team onto this form. So in the end, we decided it was a perfectly acceptable thing for her to do, to basically convert it into a PowerPoint presentation. At the end of the day, not only do you have to assess the risk, put measures in place to control them, but also to explain it to your team about what you're doing. And I thought in the end, and she was much more comfortable with that. It was funny taking risk and risk assessment and risk and hazard out of my safety context and putting it into a presentation world, which she's very used to.
The outcome, what you wanted is the outcome. Yeah.
So absolutely. So I still got the outcome, which was for her to assess the risk to her many staff.
Yeah.
And she's very, very good at standing in front of her team and explaining things to them.
Yeah.
And so for her, saying, well, the point of doing this is to safeguard your team, which you're very good at. We just need to formalize it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think health and safety is a world where you have to learn you've got to learn the concepts. I think the jargon is there and related to the concepts of it all.
Yeah.
But you all know with health and safety, everybody groans, when the health and safety manager comes around. He sort of groans when he comes around with his clipbold and tuts. Hopefully I'm not like that. Please shoot me if I am. But
I think that's the thing with the jargon, isn't it? That that's very typical. It's got associated with the form, and the actual
Yeah.
mean, people stop at there. So let's actually now get a bit more positive, because you started to transition very nicely, thank you, Glenn, to looking at jargon as an opportunity, which you started talking about there. But first of all, I know for you, particularly with the work that you do with, as you were talking about, with the Linnaean Society, with plant classification, actually, jargon has a purpose, and one of its purposes is actually to give clarity about what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. The Linnaean Society is the world's oldest natural history society in the world, and it's named after Carl Linnaeus. Now, Carl Linnaeus was the man who, in the mid 18th century, tried to bring order out of what he called chaos. So, in the very simplest of terms, what you might call the lesser spotted something or other might be called the greater spotted something or other in another part of the world. And he said that for the sake of clarity and to make sure that we all understand what we're all talking about, so that we all know we're talking about the same animal or the same plant or fungus or whatever it happened to be, we all need to share a common language, a jargon, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, it is, to those of us outside that world, it's jargon, isn't it?
Yeah. But that jargon is very specific to try and bring clarity. So all over the world, biologists, naturalists, botanists, all know that plant, that animal, whatever, by the same name, and they can talk about it in a universal language.
Yeah.
So though it is jargon by the true definition from the dictionary, because it's very technical, that the technicality of it enables people to understand it better.
Yeah.
And I would say the same about IT. I've dealt with many IT people over the years, but I appreciate the specificity of it, the exactness of it, the detail, is what it matters to them, but also it matters to your project, or it matters to what they're trying to provide you with, because it is important that it's that they all know, and particularly when you're doing specifications for companies, isn't it? If you're specifying something, we all get involved with specifying things for people to do for us. Those, jargon, if you like, becomes very important when you're writing a specification.
Yeah.
That you're using this precise, exact language.
Yeah.
So coming from a taxonomy, which is what we call the classification of plants and animals, so coming from a background of taxonomy and how we classify the world in order to understand it better, I appreciate that jargon, if you technical language, which I think is a better definition, actually can be extremely helpful. And what we have to do is we have to learn it, and those we deal with have to teach us, I think.
Yeah, so that, again, lovely link, Glenn. I'm going to move on to which for me is where I think jargon has got a really bad press, because actually we should see it as an opportunity and not as a barrier. It's all about context and how you use it, isn't it? So for me, it's a way of starting conversations. So if I'm going into an organization, we're working on a project, the themes are new, maybe even working on a project is new. If you create an environment that people can feel really comfortable about, don't know what you just talked about, can you explain? You then actually are starting a conversation which will lead you into other areas that you want to. And I think the example you gave with the risk assessment is a really good thing, isn't it? If you'd just been talking through the form, that wouldn't have worked. But by explaining the concept of risk assessment, start the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, work is about relationships, isn't it? And communication is critical.
Yeah.
And we all know that communication is often the most difficult thing to achieve, and yet we all know it's one of the most important things to achieve. So I think what we all have to do is to kind of give it a bit more effort to use that. And it's a wonderful, as you say, it's a wonderful way to start a conversation with somebody. And I've quite enjoyed projects where I've come into them and have had this sort of glossary of terms, so that you come up to speed very quickly, and so you understand that, if you like. But I think one of the things you get from someone like you, who is who trains but explains, if you like, is that understanding of how you put whatever it is you're being taught into context of how
Yeah.
to use it. And I think that's really important. So it doesn't matter how technical the information is. And believe me, I found Microsoft Windows very complicated and technical when I first started using it. But
That was a long time ago, Glenn.
It was a long time ago. But
A shared experience.
It's about understanding, isn't it? Helping to understand that language and making you think about, oh, okay, that's how I can use that language. That's how I can use that thing.
Yeah, so I think that's why it's a great tool for building teams, whether that's project teams or teams within your organisation. Also with suppliers as well, with external people as well. I know, with some of the organisations you work with in the arts, academia, it's when external people like me come in, actually getting up to speed and just, I've always felt comfortable at just saying, I haven't come across that term before, please explain. And so for me also, as you know, a big important part of my world is I'm really passionate about people learning and growing. So I think that rather than jargon being, I think because sometimes the idea is, let's not do the jargon, let's just dumb down, let's not use technical terms, whatever. But actually, as we've said there, it gives some clarity and it can actually start some conversations. So I think it's about embracing the jargon. And actually, one of the areas on the balanced scorecard, which is a good way of looking at a project or an organisation or a team and its performance, one of the areas is learning and growth. So it's, what are we doing to move the organisation forward in terms of capabilities and learning? For me, demonstrating that you can use a wider language and people can understand them is a great way of doing that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, is it? Because I've worked in an arts institution for almost 36 years as of next week, and as a subject area, the arts, and particularly art. So I work in an institution which is about decorative art, so that's paintings and furniture and ceramics and textiles and things like that. Often, one of the things that we are accused of, I think would be the way to put it, is that we use a language that people don't understand. And museums that I've been involved with over the years have tried very hard to try and see how we can change that language to make it easy to understand. But at the heart of it, there is a technical language that you need to use to ensure clarity.
Yeah.
So working in an institution which is dominated by terms like Baroque and Renaissance and Rococo and things like this, which are slightly weird terms and terms that were applied to the art world many centuries after the actual works of art were produced. But those terms were created to try and help bring clarity, so people knew that when art, So we now, going back to slightly as you were talking earlier about the unfamiliar, those terms would not have been familiar to the artists that we apply them to.
Yeah.
They've been applied later to try and help us to understand those periods of art. But I think it's interesting working for an organisation which is about learning, really, and that's the heart of what museums do, and trying to pass information across. That this learning and growth idea is very important to us, and so we're having to learn not to dumb down the language, because the language is very important to understand the subject, but perhaps explaining it better.
Yeah, so I think it's a context thing. I think understanding the audience and the context, I think if you can get that right, then it's then it serves a purpose. I think for me that the reason why jargon has probably been seen very negatively is because it's not always been very thought through about the context in which it's used. And I think we haven't touched on it, but I think we both know and we've experienced where it is actually used as a barrier on purpose, because it's a way of excluding people. And that's why for me, especially at the moment where lots of people are working remotely, building teams, being collaborative is really important. And for me, just having that environment where people go, hang on a sec, you just used that, can you explain it to me? That's a really inclusive way of working, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's a little bit, while we've all been in lockdown, we've all been exposed to quite a lot of these sort of webinars and things about how to improve your mental well-being during
Yeah,
lockdown.
yeah,
And, I think and especially doing health and safety, that's something that we've also been looking at how we maintain contact with our workforce who are scattered far and wide. And the one common feature of many of those online webinar, whatever it is don't be afraid to ask a question.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, it sounds silly, doesn't it? I mean, and if you think about all the advice that is given out about mental well-being,
yeah,
it is don't be afraid to ask for help.
yeah,
So I think it's up to us in projects to actually create a cooperative, collaborative atmosphere
yeah,
where people don't feel afraid to
yeah,
say, I'm very sorry, I don't understand. Could you just
yeah,
explain to me what that means? Because it shouldn't be, as you say, people can use it deliberately to exclude people. But I think that's bad project practice, isn't it,
yeah,
really?
yeah,
I mean, a project should be a collaborative approach,
yeah.
and people should be going along the same path together.
Yeah, and I think it actually is a two-way thing as well, because it is making sure that the language that I use people understand. But also for me, I think one of the ways I try and convey that I'm there as a collaborative team person is to question technical terms myself, and show
Sure.
an interest and acknowledge other people's knowledge that I don't have. I think that's so it is a very strong, when it's used in the right way. I think your jargon can be a real opportunity. So my summary points there are: just get over the barriers, and actually use jargon as an opportunity. Use it to start conversations. And yeah, and I'm really appreciative of you taking us through your thoughts. And is there anything else you'd like to add? You know, I always give you space to talk, Glenn.
I don't know. I would absolutely. I would say that your approach to project management is. I've seen you operate, and I've seen how you embed yourself in a project. And I think I've seen the way that you particularly encourage that dialogue,
Yeah,
because everyone's got
yeah,
something. Everyone's got something important to say. And
that's the
as I
key.
mean, and yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter who they are. They've got something to say. And the best bosses in the world, from my experience, and I've had a few, are those people who let you speak to them, listen to what you have to say. If they disagree, fine,
Yeah,
but they're given you the opportunity to speak.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
that's really
and
important.
going back to good old Cole Linnaeus, my
Yeah,
hero, where would we be? We wouldn't be Homo sapiens if it wasn't for Cole Linnaeus, because he named us. And in fact, he is the sample type. He made himself the prime example of Homo sapiens when he named us. But I'm going to paraphrase a complicated Latin phrase, which
okay.
is to
Gosh,
always
Latin.
be fascinated by, not Latin, but if you translate it into English, it sort of means be fascinated by the everyday. Look at
Wow.
everything that is around you. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
And again, we've been able to do that in lockdown as well,
yeah,
haven't we?
yeah,
We've had the time to look around our immediate surroundings, if you
yeah,
like, and
absolutely. So
learn.
people have been commenting on, I've heard birds sing, and I'm sure they've always sung, but I've just never noticed them before.
So, yes, so my aim in life is to get Cole Linnaeus into every possible sentence. So,
Which, yeah, and you've managed to get him into the podcast. So people can
yeah.
Google now. I mean, probably he himself, yeah, as you say, has would be the master of jargon to some extent. But I think that was the thing that, and as you always do, you're always able to share your knowledge and give an insight. And that was the thing when we were talking about this. I hadn't really thought about the getting clarity,
Hmm.
and I think that is really important. That as long as it's the jargon has a purpose and you're using it in the right context, then actually that's the opportunity. So yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. It's about using it in a positive way, not using it to be be a barrier to communication. It's about positive communication. It's about understanding each other.
So, and that's this, I'm just going to end on a really positive note, which is also, as you know, I hope one of my signature ways of communicating. So thanks very much.
That's all, my pleasure.
Yeah, and there's some information at the bottom of the screen there. This is on YouTube. That's where you're watching it. So if you want to leave some comments, share your least favourite words, your best favourite words, the best way of explaining your favourite words. Ask Glenn questions about Carl Linnaeus if you want to. But yeah, thanks a lot, Glenn. Really appreciate
Not at all.
it.
My
Thanks
pleasure.
again. Speak soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.